Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Williams from Mimecast. I'll be your host for this webinar, which is all about DMARC and how to become PCI compliant. PCI compliance and DMARC do not seem like a natural fit. One is focused on the security of cardholder data. The other one is focused on brand impersonation. But with the recent changes to the PCI standard with version 4 coming in March 2024, there is a need to now implement DMARC as part of the security standards for your organization. PCI compliance, in addition, touches a large number of different industries who may need to implement a DMARC record in order to be compliant. And the challenges with DMARC is we often see that it contains an air of mystery about it because not many people understand the underpinning technologies within it. So what I'd like to do as part of this webinar is for you to walk away with a good understanding about how DMARC fits into an organization, the journeys that our two panelists have undertaken in order to become compliant or as they're working through their compliance status, and any tips and tricks that they may have for you along the way. Today, I'm joined by two of our very special customers. I've got Chris Orr and Nick Hartman, and they come from two very different industries. That's the beauty of our customer base. We've got a nice variety of customers to pick from, and in order to really help speak about the challenges that they see within their industries. So Chris is the Senior Security Compliance Engineer at Ogletree Deakin, and Nick is a Security Analyst within Western Governors University. Gentlemen, today I want to say firstly, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you on the panel. And for everyone on the call, there's no house tasks that we need to deal with here. I'm sure for everyone watching, you know where the bathrooms are, you know how to get a glass of water and all of those fun tasks that we remember from a few years back. We're going to jump straight into it and really just have an opportunity to get a bit of an intro from both of you, because I think it's interesting to hear about, your industry, what you're playing in, some of your challenges before we really dive into DMARC and all of the intricacies that come with it. Chris, you're first on my screen. If you wouldn't mind just giving us a little introduction to yourself, please.
Sure. Like you said, I'm a security engineer at Ogletree Deakin, and before that, I actually worked in infrastructure for many years and was an email administrator. So I've been exposed to DMARC and other email security issues for quite a long time.
Thanks, Chris. Nick, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. I've been working in IT for the last 10 years now, just about. For the last 4, I've been in dedicated security roles in both at my previous institution as well as my current position at Western Governors. Getting DMARC implemented is one of our biggest priorities, in service to our students. And kind of like Chris, before working in security, working in various networking and infrastructure roles. So definitely seen a little bit of things.
And I think as we get a little bit more into this and the value of what DMARC brings to it, there's a lot of change in this particular aspect. And gents, I do want to ask about how you are dealing with compliance when it comes to DMARC in your individual sectors, because I noticed when performing some research, it seems to vary per area, which is a very interesting piece. But we're seeing big name providers jumping in with the recent news cycles. Microsoft, as of July this year, said that they will now be honoring DMARC records for both consumer and enterprise businesses hosted on their platforms. That's a very big change. Means we can try and reduce some of the spam and unwanted nonsense coming through. With Google jumping on board and saying in February 2024, they are looking to implement DMARC checks to try and reduce the amount of spam and phishing messages. Another layer there, that's how I like to think of it. And looking at those numbers and what they're trying to do, I think there's going to be a big shift in the market as to how things can be evolved when it comes to making sure we're getting that trust in email back. Because it's one of the things that's often forgotten about. We think as the security engineers or at a cybersecurity vendor, emails just happen. And let's be honest, with you gents being in the email engineering side of the house, I'm sure you were the first persons called when it went down. They definitely spoke to you first of all, had you on speed dial. Depends on how you add it. Chris, I'm sure you've got a horror story or two from email going down over your time.
Oh yeah, you really don't understand how important email is to an organization until it goes down, and it always gets the short end of the stick when you're talking about what are your most critical applications. But we used to joke that if our mission critical application went down, you'd hear within 30 minutes. If our email system went down, you'd hear within 1 minute. And I think that's not far from the truth.
Not at all. And this is where, combining these technology sets together can ensure that we get, or rather keep email flowing, because that's the very important part. I mean, Nick, when you're speaking to your student body and communicating with them, if email's not working, I'm sure they get a little bit frustrated or annoyed.
Yeah, for real. Student success is one of our probably our biggest driver. So, if they're not getting their communications in a timely manner, that's a big deal. We're even liable at a federal level if we don't get necessary student financial aid information out via email, which is the typical delivery of that. We could be liable as an institution. So yeah, email is extremely critical.
And I'm guessing there's quite a time-sensitive aspect to that because they've only got a set period to respond and say, yes, they need it or not.
Correct.
There we go. So we see that email is so critical to organizations, and it's always the thing that I think gets forgotten about the most. But the big one that's recently come on board, which I think is very interesting and may drive a few more institutions to adopting DMARC, is the latest PCI standard. So if anyone who's been sad enough, and I'll put my hand up to say I did read the PCI standard, but looking at that standard, we can see that we've got two aspects to it, or rather two dates that we should be aware of. Date number one being when the new standard comes into play at the end of March 2024, but you give it a grace period until the end of March 2025 to implement a DMARC record. And I think it's very important that we don't see organizations just putting in I'm going to use the official terminology here, P equals none, because that's not necessarily solving the problem. It's giving you the visibility side, but you're not actually doing anything with it. And I'm sure, for all of those on the call who may be thinking about this journey to DMARC, it's quite complex. And we'll be speaking to, Chris and Nick, and they'll be giving us this insight about what they've experienced and how easy or not easy it has been. I'm sure for your journeys, there's been a few stumbling blocks along the way that you hadn't thought about. And that definitely adds to the real fun part of that. And let's try and use this time with all of our sort of collective minds to really get across the value of DMARC and what it can mean to people, because we have seen there's a lot of challenges with people lacking understanding. I mean, I'm going to put my hand up and say that I didn't know much about DMARC prior to joining Mimecast, and I'm sure Chris and Nick, was DMARC something you were well aware of when the first standards came out, or is it something that you've had to learn along the time frame to make you actually know what it can and can't do?
Yeah, sure. DMARC has been something that's been on my radar for many years. I think the biggest issue has been getting buy-in on it to move it forward. I've been pretty clear on the benefits, but it's been difficult to express that in terms of as a counterbalance to what the downsides are. And you have to be careful how you implement it. But if you do implement it correctly, then it is a definite benefit for us.
Chris, a follow-up question to that is, looking at the research that I came across, the legal industry kind of lagging when it comes to implementing DMARC. There was a very interesting study I came across from SendLayer where they looked at all of the different implementations of DMARC across geos, and they broke out the law firms, and they took the top 167 of them, and there was sub 40% adoption of any form of DMARC. Mm-hmm. Which I found was very interesting. I would have thought the legal entities would have been like really on this. How have you found getting that buy-in to work? Because you mentioned it right up front, saying, how do I get it going? How have you found it possible to get it over the hurdle?
Well, actually at Ogletree, it was a little different because we're very email centric here. So many of our business processes flow through email. We also have a client base that's very in tune to technology issues. So they actually help drive this. So we've been getting questionnaires from our clients asking if we're implementing DMARC. And fortunately, for the last year, we've been able to say yes. So that was part of it. I think we were able to articulate effectively what the benefits are when we first started this process a couple of years ago. And I think that really helped us to get ahead of the questions that come in from the outside.
Nick, I want to bring the same question to you, but probably slightly different in terms of, Chris mentioned he's been following it along the lines, and I saw you nodding when I said it's something I hadn't known up front. Question for you is, how did you first hear about DMARC, and did you really understand what it could and couldn't do, or did you just think it was just another technology or tool set to put in place to form some form of, to provide some form of protection when it came to email?
Well, I think I had an understanding about 80% of it. So the part that I did not have is I didn't understand how to get over the hump of finding all of the unsupported applications or providers that send email on our behalf. And I think that's been part of my learning curve for the last year. I mean, I've always had a good understanding of DNS and, how a DMARC record helps to protect your brand and helps to protect your internal users from emails coming in. But the part I didn't understand and had to learn during this process was how you can effectively find those applications through what you mentioned, which is the P equals none monitor indicator.
Nick, did you have similar challenges? You were learning about DMARC and what it could do?
Yeah, for me, in my experience, DMARC wasn't necessarily something, me as at an analyst level was necessarily seeking out. It was more so dropped on my lap by management. Here, we should implement this. It'll do some good. So, starting to dig into it, I was a little overwhelmed. My DMARC journey actually started at my last position, where I got that assignment to start looking into it. But at that time, we didn't have a tool to analyze the DMARC forensic reports. We enabled the policy, but we're just getting all the reports via email, and having to parse through that manually, that's just impossible. So it wasn't until I started, in my current position at WGU, where they were using DMARC Analyzer already, had it already set up, forwarding the reports, and you could clearly see all of, your authorized senders, your unauthorized senders, which senders were in compliance with DMARC. So between having that visible representation there, as long as just doing a little bit more deep dive on the RFCs and, the free training that's out there, it was overwhelming at first, but at the end of the day, in theory, it makes a lot of sense. So that really helped between those two things.
Nick, if I ask a follow-up question to that, and you may not necessarily know the answer, but I'm sure you have done some research with the team. You were handed the tool, that's one thing, but surely there's an event that led up to that. I'm trying to find out a little bit more about why WGU implemented DMARC.
Yeah, in talking with some of the staff that has a longer tenure than me that were championing the initiative before I joined on and inherited the project. Talking with our seniors, they said they realized the need. This was about 2 years ago, and just seeing email-based attacks on the rise, and this is not a quick win in the sense of it's not necessarily easy to get all of your email flows secured with DMARC, but it's a quick win in the sense that it's some low-hanging fruit to eliminate a majority of the email threats that are out there. So it was really them kind of seeing what's going on in the threat landscape that really motivated the decision.
Chris, with you being involved with DMARC so early on, were there any different factors that brought you to come to the conclusion you need to implement a DMARC policy and DMARC Analyzer?
We did have the client drivers where they were asking us if we had DMARC, and if not, why. Our cyber insurance, that was always a question, or at least it has been recently. It's not really a requirement yet, but I think that's going to change, and I think you're going to see business partners start to demand that you implement this, because that DMARC helps them, and it helps you, but it also helps your business partners, and I think that's one of the strongest drivers is basically peer pressure. You need to implement this because it's best practice now.
But interestingly enough, Chris, I'm not sure if you're aware, in South Africa, there was a recent case where a law firm was found to be liable for a phishing email for a home purchase. And the law firm's emails had been spoofed and sent through to the individual customer to make a deposit for the home that they were in the process of purchasing. They made the deposit to the wrong bank account, naturally, because it had been impersonated. That client then took the law firm to court, and they were found to be guilty, which we think is a very interesting let's call it change in the way that the industry looks at that, because that's a very big shift to say that you are now responsible to make sure that you're protecting your email as much as possible through every channels.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Legal landscape for liability, changes continuously, but I think DMARC's becoming enough of a common practice that you really should look at your liability based on whether you have it or not.
100%. You mentioned cyber insurance. It's something that I think a lot of people don't realize how much DMARC and cyber insurance go hand in hand. Did you find that it was a necessary requirement for you to implement DMARC for your cyber insurance, or was it a nice to have?
Well, fortunately for us, we had implemented by the time that became a question from our cyber insurance providers. So I don't really know what the impact would have been had we not had it, but it very likely we would have looked at fast tracking that once those questions started for one.
Double clicking into that for a moment. Do you think let me rephrase this one again. Double clicking into that for a moment. With a requirements from a lot of cyber insurance providers saying DMARC is absolutely necessary, I'm curious as to your thoughts about whether. Sorry, Chris, I'm trying to form a question here that is not forming very well in my head. Let me try again. Third time's the charm with this one. You'd already, double clicking into this, Chris, you'd already implemented DMARC. Do you think it's going to be mandated in the future to have DMARC when it comes to cyber insurance? Or do you think it'll always be something optional?
No, I think it's going to be required. I think if you look at where we were from a cybersecurity point of view 5 years ago, things that we looked at as optional, nice to haves are now requirements. And I think DMARC is going to be one of those. I think in the next year or two, you're going to start having issues with business partners. You're going to start having issues with cyber insurance. So I think at this point, it's becoming a must-have.
I definitely see it moving much more towards that. And I'm starting to wonder how much of a insurance premium discount may be in the future without implementing some of these core technologies. It's definitely an angle that a lot of cyber insurance providers have started discussing. And we in turn have got a partnership with one of the cyber insurance providers, and they're talking about it quite a lot. So I'm intrigued to see where the market is going to be going in that particular area. Nick, a question for you. If we look at your implementation, you said you were given DMARC and a DMARC analyzer there to go and put in place. Did you have any assumptions that turned out completely differently while you were running through this? You spoke about sort of all this information, but anything that was like, hold on, this is completely different to what I thought?
Yeah, maybe one of the things that sticks out to me in trying to onboard, some of our non-compliant sources is it seems like not all vendors treat email, DMARC, and its supporting components the same way. It seems like there's some different interpretations of the various RFCs out there and how it's implemented in, vendors' email infrastructure. So even though the RFCs seem pretty cut and dry, it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach when dealing with these vendors. We might have to go this way or that way, depending, again, from what we get from the vendor.
I'm going to ask you another question along those lines for a moment. How many sources did you find that were allowed, but you weren't aware of?
A number that I really don't want to think about right now. Very, very, very eye-opening in that way. But again, that's where having the right tool set is a great way to see what's being sent on your network and on your domains.
You don't have to name it specifically. Are we talking like tens, hundreds? How big was the scale of that?
Well, again, I came into the project kind of halfway through, so a lot of the heavy lifting had been done. Probably under 50.
Under 50.
Within the 40-50 range. Still enough to, make you feel a little uneasy.
I would agree. Chris, I'd love to ask you the same question. How many did you find that were legitimate but you didn't know about?
Well, I think the total number we found was probably around 24, but we were aware of probably half of that. So we did find about a dozen entities that were sending email as us. We also found some that we didn't really know who they were. So that we looked at that as a side benefit to this project. Is we actually found people who were sending email as us that were not us. So yeah, that was definitely a nice little side benefit.
Interesting enough, I was going through our POC material for a couple of our customers and looking at the numbers that we were coming through from all of those who've undertaken a DMARC project. The smallest number of allowed, or rather legitimate sources, but they weren't aware of, was 3 to 4. The illegitimate ones, in excess of 25 on most of those projects, which I think, to your point, Nick, is quite eye-opening when you start to see how many are out there. Like, oh, wow, right, I've got a bigger problem that I need to deal with. Let's pivot, and this is a great point to start asking about timelines, because we all hear this. It takes X amount of months to implement a DMARC. The typical one is 6 to 9. I'm curious, Chris, how long did it take you to get all the way to the state that you are today? And question, actually, follow-up question or a two-parter is, where are you in that journey?
So right now we are fully P equals reject. So we are fully implemented, which is fantastic. We've done it across all the domains that we use to send email. We actually, as a part of this project, we went through, I mean, every organization owns hundreds of domains because, you have to protect your brand. So we went through and identified, I think we have 6 that we actually send email as, and we went through the other 100 and basically locked them all down immediately, which was nice. But we were able to go through and, in about it's probably 6 to 9 months. I mean, we actually could have gone a little faster, but we erred on the side of being careful. We spent a lot of time monitoring those email records that we got back, just to make sure that we weren't missing anything. We did spend about a month in quarantine, and we dealt with a couple issues there. But by the time we rolled it out, and didn't really have any complaints at all.
What was that time frame, Chris? Was it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was about 9 months. Yeah.
About 9 months. Okay, so bang on towards the end of a sort of a typical implementation. Nick, very similar question to you. Curious into where you are in your journey and how long you've been walking down this pathway.
Yeah, so I've been with WGU since November of last year, so coming up on a year, championing this DMARC initiative. Again, inheriting it. I think it was started a year prior to my arrival, so we're a little bit more when it comes to our timeline. A little bit more time. I think part of that is just given the open nature of higher education, things that we're actively trying to curtail, given the increased risk that's now even hitting our sector. So yeah, so right now we are P equals none on our main domain monitoring, but we've narrowed it down to just a few external mail flows that we're working with vendors to get going with either DKIM or SPF to get them compliant. And then we're hoping to flip the policy over to quarantine very soon.
Did you think that you would spend less time getting to this particular state, i.e. getting to a quarantine state, or have you thought, no, I've spent the right amount of time, it's what I'm expecting?
Yeah, I could probably go either way, depending how I want to look at it, what I'm prioritizing. If we're prioritizing availability of email of our that gets sent out of our third-party applications, I could say this is probably on pace given our institution and our risk profile. The security guy in me that's that wants to prioritize integrity, confidentiality, I might say I'm hoping this would have been done sooner. But again, just trying to be balanced with it.
I know in a 9-month journey, there's probably a lot of hurdles that you had to jump over to get this implemented. Could you describe a few of those hurdles for us and how you got past them?
Sure. So I think the biggest one was with the unsupported, unknown uses of email. We did find several instances where someone had set up an external remailer service of some sort, one of the big 3 or 4 of them. Tracking those people down was usually the hardest part. And one of the tricks that we used is we use Cisco Umbrella, and we actually track down people hitting the admin consoles for those products. And that led us to the correct people. And once we were able to find them, usually it's not very difficult to, get those sources compliant. And, that was finding the people was the biggest issue we had.
I'm so curious as to how you've then translated the IP addresses to the people. Please tell me more.
Well, I mean, that's one of the advantages that we have is that we know the IP address that the request is coming from, but through Umbrella, we also get the user. So that's kind of...
that is super helpful. So you could email them directly. Fantastic. Nick, you spoke a lot about how different people treat sending sources differently and different priorities. Have you found a few more roadblocks along this journey to get to this quarantine state as well?
We know what we know, but kind of what Chris alluded to, sometimes you have to go find what you don't know. And really what I'm pointing at there is really shadow IT. Not necessarily individuals in our organization that are maliciously trying to circumvent our processes, but it's just staff just trying to get stuff done. And, I get that, wanting to move quickly. But we just want to make sure those guardrails are up so we can preserve the brand. So I think one thing that's really helped with that is really working with our security risk team. We have a dedicated risk team that handles all of our risk assessments, especially for a new product that gets onboarded. So really trying to funnel these users to go get their software approved, have it get a risk assessment. And if there's an email, a third-party sending component, we send them our standards. They try to gauge, is this going to be a sender that's going to cooperate with DMARC and its components? And then they put the requester in touch with us for any additional questions. So I think that's really helped a lot in trying to, again, curtail that behavior and remove that roadblock.
You mentioned shadow IT, and that for me is a very interesting thing about DMARC is it's not just something that gets implemented by security or the IT team and it's one and done. You need to speak to so many people. On your journey to those sources that weren't compliant, did you come across any that the individual entities who'd been set up needed to be moved because they couldn't become compliant from a DMARC standard?
We've never had to move any in the sense of we've had to, end the relationship and move to a different product. But I'm actually dealing with that right now with one of the last sources trying to get, implemented with DKIM. We're running into issues again with their email infrastructure. And unless we want to try and solve it right now, I won't bore you all with the details. But we might move them in the sense where instead of sending with an @wgu.edu address, we may have to come down and say, look, you have to use the vendor's email address. We can't take on this risk. If you use the vendor's email address to send as, they'll be responsible for the DMARC, the DKIM, the SPF. So we would transfer any responsibility to them. So that's actually one we're looking at right now. And maybe in a couple of weeks, I might have an update for you on how that goes.
That's a very beautiful segue to, Chris, a question I wanted to ask you, which is, there's lots of stakeholders involved in a DMARC project. We all think it's, once again, just IT, but all of the different entities who are sending out across an organization, and it can be numerous. I think your number was 20, if my memory serves me correctly. How did you raise awareness with the various stakeholders to get their buy-in? Because it's not simple. You've got non-technical people who don't understand why you're coming to them and knocking on the door and saying, hey, I want to change something in your world.
Yeah, I really think that was the majority of the 9 months that we spent was getting buy-in and reducing risk and basically monitoring to make sure that we weren't going to disrupt the business process. So one of the things that we did is we had a list of roughly a dozen external senders, and we started with them. And then once we were able to get our monitor record in place, we were able to, over the course of a month or two, identify the other stakeholders that we didn't know about. And so once we were able to do that, we were able to get buy-in and explain how the process works and go ahead and get them compliant. And I think once we did that, we got it to the point where when we were ready to go to quarantine or to reject, that we really didn't have anyone objecting because their, critical process had already been taken care of.
It's a very good bit of insight. Now, I think a large portion of a DMARC project is very much what you've mentioned, Chris. It's getting those people involved, but that prep work makes it much more streamlined later on down the way. And people often forget because they go, oh, I've just got visibility and I'll make a change. But what you spoke about there, I think is very, very key. And for everyone on the call, take heed from what Chris has said. That's where you're going to spend the big bulk of your time. That is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, because once you've got them on side, they're then going to be actively working with you to get to a P equals reject state. Chris, just a follow-up question to that is, how did you translate the very technical terms of DMARC to your stakeholders so they knew what you were trying to achieve? Was there any particular tips and tricks you've got for everyone?
We just came up with an analogy that had to do with snail mail. And basically, we just explained it in such a way that, we want you to be sending as an official sender. And basically we would just kind of frame it as a stamp of approval. And, we took your cloud provider that sends email as us, and we made sure that we put our stamp of approval on it, which explaining DKIM to, an attorney or paralegal, a little difficult, but once we were able to explain it as, something that's endorsed and official, that's language they speak. So I think you have to, in these kind of cases, speak the language of your users.
I'm very curious to hear your analogy if you are willing to share it with us.
It was basically around endorsing it. It was making sure that, they understood that this, we were basically officially blessing what they were doing, and we were making sure that the emails would get delivered. And I think when you frame the question for, when you frame the issue for them, when you show it as we're going to increase the deliverability of your emails, then they understand that also.
Very important points there. Making sure that people are aware of what it is and speaking the language. I think there's far too many times, and I'm sure I'm going to get nods from both of you, where acronyms are just the worst thing out there, and non-IT or compliance teams, they just don't understand it. And we just speak in an acronym world, or acronym soup is what I'd like to call it. It's what we exist in. Nick, jumping to you for a moment, I'm just curious in terms of this implementation of DMARC. Have you been the only one, or has it been a collaborative effort across a much broader team to get this implemented and ultimately get to the state that you're just about to move towards?
Yeah, actually, there's been a lot of collaboration within security, just working to get our initial plan together. And for me, looking for some guidance has been really helpful. But then really that collaboration has really extended to every application owner, every business contact that we've interacted with as we work to get their email flows, in compliance with DMARC. So again, kind of like Chris was saying, reaching out to them, getting them to see the benefits of doing so, but also the risks involved. I know phishing has been of principal concern for a few years now, and just helping our partners within the business to see that once we can take DMARC to the enforcement stage, so-and-so hacker in the basement over there won't be able to send us wgu.edu, and we can prevent a bulk amount of phishing email from even getting to our mail server. So I think that's resonated a lot with our users, that really they can do their part, as we all have this shared responsibility in security these days.
I'm curious, was that the analogy that you utilized with your partners? Were you speaking about the hacker in the basement, or did you have a snail mail example?
It was actually a little of both. Explaining how DKIM worked. I'm right there with Chris with the stamp of approval. That's exactly what we used. But yeah, then that was my analogy. A good reason why we want to do this and what it prevents. Because again, I think with what's going on in the news and really with all of our security awareness around phishing, I think a lot of our users within WGU, it's on their minds. So it's a great thing to take advantage of, or to capitalize on, rather.
Some good advice about stories and then bringing it and making it relatable. Chris, you've moved to P equals reject policy, which is the great thing. What positive impact have you seen since you've implemented that policy?
Well, I think it's more of what we don't see. So we don't have issues with our business partners. We don't have, impersonation, or not impersonation, but people sending email, spoofing us. We just don't hear about that anymore. So Before, we would occasionally hear people, asking, what a particular email was that was not from us, and we don't have that problem anymore. So, a lot of times with security, it's what doesn't happen, and it's kind of difficult to quantify that sometimes. So, that's basically what I would say. We just don't hear about this kind of thing anymore because it shouldn't happen if people are properly honoring a DMARC record.
Are you still seeing illegitimate sources attempting to send email, even having implemented a reject policy? Or is it everything being clear for the past while since you put it in place?
Occasionally. I mean, I think once we did put the people's quarantine in, that kind of went down a little bit. I mean, we occasionally still see it, but, like I said, with all these major providers starting to honor DMARC records, spoofing people is becoming harder and harder for malicious actors.
It's interesting. I suppose it will be very interesting to see a little way down the line how the actors start changing their tactics with all of these different checks and everything put in place. And I'm always very, very intrigued. Chris, are you able to share what country have you seen most malicious emails come from, if you would have just do it at a broad level?
Well, to be honest, I don't know that I really have that information. I mean, for the most part, we were able to track down where, some of these came from when we're in the middle of the process. I want to say most of them came from the United States, but, I don't really have that in front of me. I mean, I remember we were able to track those IPs to the sender, but, most of what we were seeing were coming from like legitimate providers, but they were not authorized, basically.
Oh, okay, and that was the bulk of where your pain was in terms of DMARC. So, Jedwin, I just want to say, firstly, thank you very much for taking the time to share your stories. I think there's a lot of valuable insight information that people can take from hearing what you've gone through. If we do a quick recap, Chris went down a very standard implementation, took 9 months. He knew about most of his sending sources, or rather half of his sending sources. Most of them were legitimate. And she's been able to get to a key equals reject policy relatively quickly. Nick is a further along his journey in terms of he's not, or rather not further along, he's longer in terms of time frame to getting to a almost quarantine state. Nick, if my memory serves me correctly, haven't quite done the switch just yet, but working a lot with business partners to make sure that we have the right legitimate sources in place. And what we've heard from both parties is there are some challenges that take place. It's not a simple thing where you can just flip the switch. You've got to be speaking all across the organization to make sure that people are aware of DMARC, its effect, and why you would do it. And then lastly, make sure you're speaking the right language for everyone to get them on board, because the quicker you can do that, the quicker you can move these different sending sources into a legitimate state. Now, this is the part where we get to open it up to live Q&A questions, and we afford all of you an opportunity to ask these two fine gentlemen something to really get the insight that they've learned from their time with us. So what I would say is please, go through the chat panel, put those different questions in, and we can get them answered for you. Brittany, just for reference, we're going to take a quick pause here so we can make sure we get the question answered. Gents, is there anything, before I ask any questions, anything that's out of bounds? Just want to double check with everyone. I'm not trying to ask you any weird and wonderful questions, but anything that you don't want me to ask you, please just let me know.
I think everyone would be a little hesitant to discuss specific incidents, but I think with DMARC, that's going to be really difficult.
Yeah, it'd be quite simple. How did you land up making a decision to go with DMARC Analyzer?
Well, for us, it was fairly easy. We were already a Mimecast client, so we were using archiving and email security already. So it was fairly logical. And after going through, what the product did, it made it, pretty much a no-brainer for us.
The power of the platform, I think, is really strong. And a lot of people forget what you can do within a singular product suite. Nick, I see a question coming here about ease of implementation. You spoke about how this was dropped in your lap and you had to take this project on. How simple has it been for you to get up to speed with DMARC Analyzer and the ability to understand what's taking place in terms of all the data in the console?
It was fairly straightforward, which I appreciated. Everything when it comes to the interface of the console, very easy to learn. very straightforward. All of your management as far as managing your SPF record, at least we have management of our SPF record integrated with our DMARC analyzers. So that's been really handy, making our lives easier, and just being able to drill down into your specific sending sources per your domain. I found it very helpful as far as, figuring out which sources are authorized, not authorized. Couldn't be more happy with the product.
Have there been any compliance requirements outside of cybersecurity that anyone needs to adhere to, and the reason for you implementing DMARC? Chris, on your side?
Well, I mean, we do have cyber insurance, which does ask questions about, DMARC and other email security issues. We do have clients that ask us about it also, and the final thing is that it really is a best practice. So, I mean, there's a variety of reasons.
And all very good reasons. And, those the key things we want everyone to remember is, Chris's world is very, very a B2C. So there's going to be a lot of push from outside of his organization. Nick, I'm guessing you've got a lot more from an internal perspective where you're trying to protect your users as much as possible. And those are sort of some key drivers for looking to implement DMARC. I'm going to cap it off there and say thank you, everybody. It's been great for all your questions that have been submitted. And we will do our best to answer anything else that hasn't been answered live during the session. And Chris and Nick, just thank you again for your time. It's really been insightful to learn about your journeys into implementing DMARC. And once again, we appreciate you sharing everything that you could do with us, and hopefully everyone's learned from what Chris and Nick were able to share with us.